everybody that fucking believes in that shit, bigotry!
Conservatism can never really be punk because you can't be a rebel and then lick the boot of the state. I'm sick and tired of hearing the same lack of understanding about the spirit of punk rock and what it means to be punk. Some people do in fact need to be gatekept, and I'd argue that the people that I'm about to mention are some of them. However, this is not to be confused with people who hear this narrative that I'm about to debunk and accidentally fall for it. Everyone makes mistakes, and I understand that we are all growing in our own journeys. This doesn't apply to you if you were just simply unaware or ignorant of this problem here. Okay, so tell me if you've heard this before. Punk is about doing whatever you want. To that I say, no, it is not. Punk means different things to different people, but I would argue that punk rock is about rejecting the status quo, especially if it is unjustly enforced on you. Let me ask you some hypotheticals here. Catholic priests who molest children dating as far back as the 1940s and possibly even further back do whatever they want. Are they punk rock? Brock Turner did whatever he wanted. Is he punk rock? Entire governments who rule and dominate over people every single day do what they want to do. Are they punk rock? What about the police, like in the United States, where they kill black people all the damn time? They do whatever the fuck they want to do. Are they punk rock? What about the Confederate States of America, who owned slaves and fought to maintain slavery? Was the Confederate State of America punk rock because they called themselves rebels? Slavery requires the stripping of people's autonomy. So is that punk rock, stripping people of their autonomy? Adolf Hitler did whatever he wanted. Is he punk rock?
That right there is Godwin's law, and your argument is in Oh, so are you advocating for violence?
If these people are punk rock, then you'd have to then argue that the very people who maintain the status quo are punk rock. People in punk bands and people in punk scenes are often in those scenes and bands because they've been ostracized and marginalized in some way that is also enforced by the status quo. Whether they are queer and were kicked out of their homes, whether they are a person of color and were on the receiving end of state racist violence, whether they are recovering from drug addiction and navigating the dwindling resources available to them, whether they are disabled and sometimes can't even leave the fucking house to go to a punk show, whether they are even women trying to fight for their own autonomy in the punk space. Punk was born out of a necessity for a space for those who have been systematically ostracized, marginalized, and outcasted. I've known cisgender, heterosexual, white males who are very wealthy in punk scenes before. Oftentimes, they aren't there for much longer than a month or two. But as punk is in fact for everyone, these are the people who are the loudest in the sentiment that punk is just doing whatever the fuck you want, because that's their relationship to the scene. Now, of course, there are exceptions that are made, and it doesn't always apply here. And this isn't to say that every cisgender, white privileged male is some kind of Nazi punk. On the contrary, and that analysis would be very myopic. But simply just saying that punk is about whatever, it's anything, it's chaos, it's anarchy, whatever, is completely avoiding the class analysis of the role of the scene entirely. I mentioned anarchy earlier, but sometimes people don't truly understand what anarchism is and how it relates to the punk scene, other than anarcho-punk for that matter. Anarchism is a rejection of hierarchy. Anti-archos is how you can break this down to literally translate the word into anti-hierarchical. I have no authority over people. I can't enforce any rules. Even this video, I can't enforce anything. I'm only speaking my own piece here. But people in some form of power, whether politically, socially, or economically, have a form of class privilege to govern those laws in the first place, stripping people of their autonomy in the process, thus creating the necessity for a punk scene. People who can do whatever they want swim in a wealth of privilege that most punks cannot afford. And oftentimes, these very people are against a very class analysis that often views themselves as inherently antagonistic and in conflict with the very punk scene that they are trying to assimilate with. Yet, they are a fish out of water. You can also bet your ass that the same people who say that punk is about doing whatever you want are also the same people that say punks are stupid. Sure, lots of punks are dumb, but a lot of punks aren't very dumb. In fact, a lot of very well-spoken anarchists are punks first before they are anarchists. And that is because, once again, they are marginalized from the status quo. When someone puts on punk clothes, or punk patches, or punk jackets, or punk rock studs, or spikes their hair, or dyes their hair, or rips their clothes, or wears cool shoes, these people are embracing an identity because they are already marginalized. And what makes these people so fucking cool is that they are embracing the fact that they are marginalized and they don't care. If anything, they are sticking it up to the man, the very system that enforces the status quo that marginalized them in the first place. That's why punks have a lot of songs against police, against racism, against fascism, capitalism, imperialism. That's why they are there. That's why they sing these songs. It's because they've been marginalized by different things. And every punk has a different story to tell. Some were ostracized because of religion, because of bigoted family, because of racism at school and in the police. Some people may ask, okay, but why are there still reactionary, bigoted, hateful people in the punk scene still? Why do they still exist? This is an interesting question that is actually in good faith, and I've got a few answers, although my answers may not be the correct answers. I'm also looking for some input and feedback in the comment section. Feel free. The first thing we need to understand is something called the Overton window, which is what is acceptable to talk about within the mainstream. When right-wing or left-wing politics are more commonly accepted into the mainstream, that is where the Overton window shifts. In the 60s, there was the hippie movement. Not to conflate the hippies with punks, of course, because hippies are upper-class fuckers who honestly do not understand a damn thing about class analysis in the first place. Not to mention, a lot of the grassroots movements that took place in the 60s were from, well, grassroots movements like the Black Panther Party and the Rainbow Alliance. I mean, after all, need I mention the Stonewall riots of the 1960s. But because of the hippies' resistance to the Vietnam War, there was a shift in the Overton window to allow for a punk scene to exist in the first place. Because, after all, the hippies were pretty friggin' mainstream.
Kick off the jams, motherfucker!
The 1970s began to see a rise of when these punk scenes started to occur in places like London, New York City, Los Angeles, etc. And it's also important to remember that these specific neighborhoods had a vast diversity of communities that were also struggling from the status quo. So obviously, when there's a lot of people congregated in one neighborhood or one community from multiple different ethnic backgrounds who are struggling under a common enemy, you're bound to get some tolerance here and there. You're bound to get some people who are pretty chill with one another, who get each other. And sometimes, when you're lucky, you get class solidarity. And that level of class solidarity is how punk scenes, especially at a grassroots level, sustains itself. The 1980s, on the other hand, was a very interesting time because we not only got the rise of the American hardcore scene, but we also got to see the Reagan administration as well as the PMRC. This was when the conservative front of the American political system was targeting, well, not just punks, but also rappers, metalheads, blues artists. I did another video on this entirely. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested. The Reagan administration obviously didn't just affect the queer community, it also affected various marginalized people groups, and this is what made the punk scene more united.
If the kids are united, they would never be divided. If the kids are united, they would never be divided.
Since the 1980s, as we go through the 90s and 2000s, punk has kind of become more memorialized and celebrated as something of the past, with punk bands like Green Day selling out, and more veteran punk bands like Misfits and the Sex Pistols being revered in a dogmatic sense. At this point, punk became less about giving space to the black sheep of the status quo, and it becomes more about the memorialization of these individual punk rock celebrities. Which is why I believe we're now seeing a rise of so-called punks and classic punks having really reactionary views. Let's take the example of Johnny Lydon, also known by his stage name of Johnny Rotten. Johnny Rotten is very widely known for being the singer of the Sex Pistols, but also for his support of Make America Great Again, or MAGA for short. Even though Donald Trump is more widely understood and recognized for using this rhetoric and slogan, it's actually been used by presidential campaigners before. Like Ronald Reagan. So is Ronald Reagan punk rock now because he does whatever the fuck he wants? And even if we're not applying Ronald Reagan's use of the term Make America Great Again, as punks in the year of 2023 as of recording this, I've gotta ask the primary question, when was America ever great? Was it great when the Democratic Party founded the PMRC? Was America great when cops stormed the Black Flag show that was hosted by K-Rock? Was it great when the most revolutionary thing we had for music at the time was Elvis Presley? What about when jazz and blues was invented, and jazz and blues was racially ostracized and marginalized as well by racists? Because oftentimes you hear racist, fascist, and conservatives saying that punk isn't music, but people said that about jazz and blues as well. Was America great when we had slavery, or the transatlantic slave trade, or the Asian Exclusion Act? Hell, what about the Anarchist or Immigrant Exclusion Act? So then, I gotta ask the question, if Make America Great Again is the backbone philosophy for the current trend that is conservative is the new punk, when was America great to begin with, and more importantly, how the fuck is conservatism, which is about reversing all of our social and economic progress backwards, in any way punk rock? When did defending the status quo become punk rock? I must have missed the memo when being a chicken shit spineless coward was punk rock. And I don't care if Johnny Rotten was the member of the Sex Pistols. I don't care if the Sex Pistols were around 20 years before I was born. I don't fucking care. If you can't even question the legitimacy of Johnny Rotten's use of his social capital, then how can you even question authority in the fucking first place? Give me a break. Okay, sure, Johnny Ramone was an anti-communist. G.G. Allen existed. Michael Graves is a Proud Boy. Maybe learn to kill your heroes sometimes? I don't know, I'm not your mom. But remember what I said earlier, some people deserve to be gatekept. Because what is often misunderstood as punks just doing whatever they want is actually punks going to a space, being like a punk show or part of the punk scene, as an escape from the oppressive clutches that is the status quo. But if punk is to be divorced from anti-authoritarian sentiments and anti-authoritarian subculture, then Rock Against Bush, Rock Against Fascism, and hell, even bands like Crash, Propaganda, The Clash, The Dead Kennedys, Dystopia, Os Rotten, The Dumpsters, The Infested, Suicide Machines, Nausea, Ambient, Scape, Doom wouldn't exist in the first place. Even bands who are apolitical, like Black Flag, have pretty anti-authoritarian sentiments, like in their song Police Story. The skinhead movement in the 1960s didn't just happen in a vacuum. The 1960s skinhead movement was very diverse, and a lot of skinheads found themselves at odds with a lot of other people in Britain at the time who were anti-immigrant, getting into street brawls with British nationalists and police. They didn't just do whatever they wanted, they defended their community. Nazi skinheads were created in the 1980s as a means to try to divert and culturally appropriate the skinhead movement. And unfortunately, the Nazis were so successful at this that now when you mention the word skinhead, they are now commonly misunderstood as Nazis. And that's because Nazis have culturally appropriated it. Speaking of which, Nazis culturally appropriate a lot of things, like the swastika, it wasn't theirs originally. Pepe the Frog, it wasn't theirs originally. And even the creator of Pepe the Frog doesn't agree with the alt-right.
Yeah, as you can imagine, Nazis are not very creative, they're not original. And ideologically speaking, Nazism, fascism, and all brands of conservatism all stifle creativity in some way. You ideologically could not be punk even if you tried. So that's why Nazis have to kind of steal ideas from other people. They're not really all that bright. I wonder what Adolf Hitler would say if he existed in the era of punk rock. He would call punk rock degenerate art, and he would put that in a degenerate art museum and probably burn punk albums as well. And not in the CD kind of way. I mean in the, you know, the old-fashioned way.
Even the term National Socialism is so ironic because they are anti-socialist, even anti-Marxist in principle. And since the Nazis in Germany were anti-union, I now have to ask the question, is it punk rock to be anti-union? Think of the implications of that. And that, my friends, is the danger of letting conservatives and Nazis into the scene in a vacuum, especially under the misunderstood pretense that punks just do whatever the fuck they want. And fully understanding that the punk scene is not fully monolithic, I bet you that if you ask a punk if they had principles, convictions, values, things that they actually care about, regardless as to whether or not they are reactionary, they will tell you that they have at least some kinds of principle. That punks have some kind of moral code and moral conviction that they at least stand by. Even something like nihilism is a standard, because at least they believe that they are not significant in the world. That is a standard that they hold. So this is to say that punks don't just rebel like just to rebel. They rebel because they have a reason, a conviction. Even if they say that they are rebelling without a cause, well, the cause is because everything else is telling them not to rebel. If someone genuinely, wholeheartedly believes that punk is just about doing whatever the hell you want, then maybe keep an eye on that person, because they might try to be predatory and creepy, and they might even use that as an excuse to complain that when they were held accountable, that they were just cancelled.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
Last thing I want to say is some people have stated that a lot of the newer generations of punk, being like the later millennials and the Gen Zers, are a lot more sensitive these days, and there's no way in hell they could be punk. I don't think so. I'm a millennial. I was born in 1991. I have lived the millennial experience of being punk, and I can say for certain that a lot of millennials are either very up to date with what's going on and a lot more tolerant of different people, not just like one group of person or the other. There's a lot more diversity and tolerance within millennials. But Gen Zers, they're leading the punk scene right now, and honestly, I couldn't be more proud of them. Gen Zers are some of the first punks to actually hold really problematic people in their scene accountable, and I don't want to take away from that at all. If anything, I want to encourage Gen Zers to hold more accountability and to be more fierce about kicking certain bastards out of the fucking scene. Otherwise, you got fucking Nazis hanging out with ya. When the Dead Kennedys wrote the song Nazi Punks Fuck Off, they didn't title the song Nazi Punks Fuck Off, but it's okay if Michael Graves is a Proud Boy. They said Nazi Punks Fuck Off. And it's not just a good song because it's a good song in a vacuum. It has a message for generations to come.